I was 23 when my life really ended, not one of those slow, predictable deaths that you feel coming. It was a simple 3-minute phone call that brought everything crashing down. The accident was bad. The policeman's voice sounded tired. There were no survivors. My mother, my father, a tree, a country road. No warning, no chance to say goodbye. I was left with an overdue mortgage, an 8-year-old brother haunted by fear, and a pile of debts that seemed to laugh in my face every morning. His name was Ethan, which was ironic because Ethan means strong, and at that time, he could barely get out of bed without crying. For the first few months, I balanced on invisible threads. 2 shifts at the corner cafe, early morning jobs, neighbors whispering behind the curtains. Everyone said, "You're so strong." Nobody saw the part where I sat on the bathroom floor in the middle of the night, trying to decide whether to pay the electricity or buy milk. Ethan was a sweet boy, the kind of kid who believes that a hug can fix anything, but hugs don't pay for school, or clothes, nor the medication he had to start taking after his first bouts of anxiety. I became a mother, a father, a counselor, a hitchhiker, a cleaner, a nurse, all while trying to maintain a minimally functional version of myself so as not to scare him even more. Sometimes I would lie on the hard mattress we had improvised in our small apartment and count the footsteps of our upstairs neighbor, just to remind myself that I was still alive. No one sent flowers, no relatives showed up. Distant uncles disappeared like ghosts. Family friends evaporated into thin air. It's funny how tragedy selects who really matters in your life. In our case, there was hardly anyone left. In the beginning, I swore I would give Ethan a normal life. I planned birthdays out of colored paper. I painted walls with cans of paint on sale. I worked 3 weekends in a row just to buy a used video game and see that silly smile of his back. But normality was a luxury we couldn't afford. The school called with complaints. Ethan was isolating himself. He didn't talk to anyone. Sometimes he'd come home with a dirty uniform, his eyes empty. I'd ask him what had happened. He'd say, "Nothing." And I believed him, because believing was easier than admitting that maybe I was failing him. When he turned 10, I began to realize the weight of what I had done. I wasn't a mother, I was just a broken sister trying to patch up a sinking ship with duct tape and empty promises. He grew up, and each new phase came with a more difficult version to deal with. Redder notes, longer silences, suspicious looks. At 11, Ethan started lying. Little things at first, a hidden sweet, ignored homework, then sporadic runaways, fights at school, a robbery in a neighborhood shop that almost cost us what little respect we still had in the community. I tried to talk. I tried to understand. But there was a wall between us, a wall that I myself had helped to build, putting work, bills, and survival before everything else. One night, I caught him asleep, cuddled up in one of our father's old jackets. I cried silently at the bedroom door because I knew that this lost child was trying to find a piece of a life that I could no longer offer. If I had known back then what Ethan would become, maybe I would have done something different, or maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe the only choice I really had was to lose in a slower way. But you can't see the end coming while you're still running to save the beginning. When I was 13, Ethan called me enemy during an argument. I had complained because he came back at 3 in the morning with the smell of cigarettes and a blank stare that reminded me eerily of our parents' stare in the coffin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him. But all I could do was mutter, "I'm not your enemy, Ethan. I'm the only one left." He laughed, a bitter laugh that didn't suit that voice still changing from adolescence. "I never asked you to stay." I had no answer to that, just the metallic taste of disappointment rising in my throat. The next morning, I made pancakes, as if a lame breakfast could sew back together what had already been torn too much. Over time, I learned not to expect gratitude. Every achievement of his, an award at the science fair, a place at summer school, I celebrated in silence. Every failure, school suspension, police knocking on the door, I hid under my tongue like an ulcer that wouldn't heal. At 17, Ethan passed the entrance exam for a university in another state. I sold the old car, which was more rust hole than car, to pay for his tuition. He didn't look back when he got on the bus. Not even a letter, not even a thank you. In the months after Ethan left, the house seemed to swallow up what little life remained in it. The walls, once scrawled with his drawings, now seemed too smooth, too cold. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart beating fast, forgetting for a second that I no longer needed to get up to see if he had nightmares. I tried to keep in touch. I'd send messages talking about the weather, silly things I'd come across on the street and thought he'd like. On the other side, there was almost always silence. When a reply came, it was short, dry, like someone answering out of obligation. I stopped insisting after a while, not because I stopped caring, but because the shame of appearing desperate was greater than any longing. The money kept coming out of my account: college tuition, dorm rent, books. And when his card didn't work, it was to me that he sent a transfer asking for help. Never with a please, never with a thank you. Life went on the way it does when you have no other choice: work in the morning, odd jobs in the evening, improvised microwave dinners. Some days I pretended to myself that everything was fine. Other days I leaned against the closed door of his room, still the way he left it, as if that would do any good. Time doesn't heal, it only tires. When I got the first call from the university, I thought it was something wrong, but the woman on the other end of the line spoke with too much enthusiasm for it to be bad news. Ethan had won an important award. They wanted to invite the family to the ceremony. I listened to her explain, sitting on the edge of the bed with a sock in my hand and my head somewhere else. Of course, I didn't say that he hadn't considered me family for a long time. I spent the evening looking at the digital invitation they sent out afterwards. I could have gone, hidden at the back of the auditorium, applauded with the others. I might even have been able to believe for a few minutes that I was still part of his story. But I didn't. I chose not to watch what I already knew would be difficult to swallow. The following Monday, an article about the event appeared on the university's homepage. His photo jumped off the screen. Blazer lined up, perfect smile, winner's pose. Below, in quotation marks, were the words that tore me apart in a way that no absence ever could. I grew up alone. I faced everything with no support, no family, only with my will to win. I read it again, thinking maybe I'd got it wrong, but I didn't. It was there, wide open for anyone to see, alone, with no support and no family. I closed the computer with the strength of someone holding back a scream. I went into the kitchen, and for a second I forgot why I had gotten up. I stood in the middle of the room watching the clock blink 2:47 a.m., trying to figure out if that was it. If everything I had done, every sleepless night, every debt taken on, every resignation I had never told anyone about, had evaporated in 3 polished sentences to impress an audience. The following week, I canceled the automatic deposits to his account. I didn't text him to explain. It wouldn't have done any good. At this point, I was as irrelevant as the water bills I paid in my parents' name until last year, out of sheer stubbornness. The house became even emptier, if that was possible. I took longer at work, just so I wouldn't have to face the silence. When people asked me about him, because there's always someone who does, I said I was fine. It wasn't a lie. He seemed to be living the dream I'd dreamed for him. I'd just forgotten to mention that in order to build that dream, he needed to erase me from history. One afternoon on my way home from work, I saw a girl sitting on the steps of the building, crying into her phone. She must have been about 15, maybe less. "I know you don't call, Mom. I just wish someone would." Her scream entered me like an echo of everything I'd never said out loud. I crossed the street without looking back. You learn to survive abandonment. Time went by. Important dates became just ordinary days. Birthdays without congratulations. Christmas without cards. His absence stopped being an open wound and became an ugly but dry scar. I swore I was over it. I really did, until an old friend from the neighborhood sent me a message. "Did you see? Ethan's launching a company. It's all over the place." I opened the link without thinking, and there he was again. Smiling photo. An article saying how he built everything himself, coming out of a childhood marked by loneliness. It was clear. For Ethan, I never existed. Or if I did, it was a script error that he needed to erase in order for his story to make sense. At first, I thought about writing a letter, tell him everything, put it on the record, not as an accusation, but as the truth. I spent whole nights rehearsing the words, scribbling down sentences that ended up crumpled at the bottom of the drawer before dawn. Then I realized that he wouldn't care. A letter from me would just be another annoyance that was easy to ignore, like the dozens of messages he had left unanswered over the last few years. The right idea came to me on an ordinary morning, one of those when life seems to drag you along without asking permission. I was sorting through an old box at the back of the closet, trying to separate clothes for donation, when I found the blue folder. Inside, all his college payment receipts, rent receipts, invoices for his new laptop, even the contracts I signed as guarantor so he could rent his first off campus apartment. I ran my fingers over the yellowed papers, feeling a deaf rage rise in my chest. Each signature was a promise, each payment a waiver. And now, in that new polished narrative he was selling to the world, I was an invisible line, a stain that needed to be erased. I put everything back in the folder and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as if I could find some answer in the flaws in the floor. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it. All I knew was that I couldn't pretend it didn't exist any longer. The next few days were strangely quiet. I worked as usual, did the week's shopping, paid the overdue bills. The difference was that I now carried the weight of that ignored truth with me, and it changed the texture of everything I touched. When the official opening of his company was announced at a big event in the city center, I understood that the universe had decided for me. I didn't need to invade the stage or make a fuss. It was enough to be there. I just needed to exist in a way that he couldn't erase. I bought the cheapest ticket, without the right to gifts or cocktails. I wore a simple, almost anonymous outfit. I didn't want to attract attention. I wanted to be a silent reminder, a discreet thorn in his carefully constructed perfection. The auditorium was packed, important people, businessmen, journalists, bright lights, forced smiles, incessant flashes. I sat at the back, near the exit, in a corner where most people wouldn't even look. When he took the stage, the audience applauded as if they were watching a living legend. Ethan looked different, taller, more confident, emptier too. He began his speech by talking about obstacles, sleepless nights, silent battles against loneliness. Each word was like a needle threading slowly into the skin. I stood there motionless, watching without blinking. In a moment, our gazes met, quick, instinctive, and it was like a thin crack going through all that shiny varnish. He recognized it. There was no doubt. A micro-expression at the corner of his mouth, a brief waver in the tone of his voice. No one else noticed, but I did, and that was enough. I didn't have to do anything but be there, whole, real, the living memory of what he tried to rewrite. I left the event before the end. I didn't wait for the endless speeches or the forced networking selfies. I walked through the still-lit streets, feeling the cold wind cutting across my face, and for the first time in a long time, I breathed, without my chest feeling oppressed. On my cell phone later that evening, I saw that he had sent me a short message. "Were you there?" I deleted the message and turned off my cell phone. The past doesn't change, but sometimes just by refusing to be erased, you change everything. When I woke up the next day, the world looked exactly the same. The walls were still bare, the dishes forgotten in the sink, the same smell of reheated coffee permeating the air. No great transformation, no magical feeling of justice being done. Just me, the same old me, trying to exist in a space where the past still throbbed like a barely healed wound. I went to work, as if nothing had happened. I took the crowded bus, listened to the same empty conversations from the passengers around me, answered emails that meant nothing. On the outside, it was just another day like so many others. But inside, something had shifted, like a heavy piece of furniture being dragged around, making the old floor of my soul creak. I thought about replying to his message while I was cleaning my desk, but I soon gave up. There was nothing I could write that would fill the void he had left. No tidy sentence would be able to give back the lost years, or glue back the parts of me that he threw away without looking where they fell. On the way home, I saw a child stumbling on the sidewalk and instinctively reached out to support her. She smiled, that shy smile of someone who still believes that the world is a safe place, and continued running without saying thank you. I found it funny how small gestures stick with us, even after so long being forgotten by others. At home, I put my bag down on the sofa and stared at my cell phone lying on the table. No new message, no attempt to continue the conversation. It was as if that "were you there" had been sent more to ease his conscience than out of any real desire to hear me out. I prepared some dinner and ate it standing up in the kitchen without thinking much about it. Then I sat on the balcony, looking out at the city's blank sky, and let my mind travel to places I'd never had the courage to live. I remembered the birthdays I spent alone, the Christmas when I prepared dinner for two and ended up eating alone. I remembered the days when I came home from work exhausted and found the house upside down, with Ethan locked in his room, ignoring my existence. All of this pouring out silently inside me without warning. As much as I wanted to believe that that night in the auditorium had been enough to close this chapter, the truth is that some wounds don't heal just because you want them to. They're still there, hidden under the skin, waiting for the right moment to throb again. A few days later, I saw a post from him on social media. Another tribute, another Entrepreneur of the Year award, smiling photos with local politicians, captions talking about overcoming, about building your own story with courage and determination. I closed the app before nausea engulfed me. It wasn't envy nor anger. It was just a dry sadness. The kind you can't cry over. You just swallow it like a bitter pill without water. Inside, I knew that the story sold in the headlines was just a pretty version of a reality full of holes. But the world applauded anyway. The world always applauds those who know how to tell a good lie. I went back to work, back to the overdue bills, back to inventing reasons to keep waking up every day. And deep down, I began to accept that perhaps he would never recognize what I had done. Maybe he wouldn't even remember it properly. Life isn't a movie where the truth always comes out at the end. In real life, injustice sometimes remains. It remains like an invisible scar, like a forgotten name on the thank you list of someone you helped pick up off the ground. A few weeks later, I found myself going through the old box of documents again, the same one I found months ago. The receipts, the invoices, the letters from school, all still there, intact. Each sheet a silent reminder of who I had been when no one else wanted to be. This time, I didn't cry. I didn't tear anything up. I didn't even think about sending it to him, like an inverted trophy. I put everything back, taped the box shut, and wrote a name on it, my end. I put it in the back of the cupboard, where the light hardly reaches it. It wasn't about him recognizing me anymore. It was about me finally stopping waiting. Looking strong on the outside was easy. It was hard not to lose yourself on the inside, but the truth was that I had already lost a lot. I didn't need to lose myself, too. The phone rang later that night, breaking the thick silence in the room. An unknown number. I answered without thinking. On the other end, a rehearsed formal voice asked if I could attend a town hall event, a tribute to citizens who have contributed anonymously to the education of young people in the community. I thought about refusing. I thought about hanging up. But something inside me, perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, made me accept. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post anything. I didn't call any friends. When the day came, I sat at the back of the room as usual. I saw names being called. I saw timid applause. I saw faces that carried stories too heavy to be summarized in plastic medals. When mine was called, I walked to the stage feeling the ground wobble under my feet. I received a simple certificate with my name spelled wrong. I smiled anyway, not because I thought it would pay for the years I'd lost, but because somehow it was nice to be seen, even if it was by strangers. On the way out, I bumped into an old teacher of Ethan's, someone I hadn't seen for over a decade. He recognized me on the spot and shook my hand. "You meant everything to him back then," he said with watery eyes. I shook my head in silence, without correcting him, without explaining that perhaps Ethan didn't agree with that anymore. I walked home that night feeling the cold through my coat, but for the first time without feeling empty in the chest. The following weeks passed like pages torn from an old calendar. Each day was the same as the last. Each morning began with the same automatic ritual of waking up, putting on the same old shabby clothes, and pretending there was still something left to achieve. Little by little, his shadow stopped occupying every space, not because it had disappeared, but because I had learned to shrink my pain to fit into the corners that remained. Real life doesn't wait for us to be ready. While I was still sewing together the torn parts of myself, new debts arrived, new routines had to be fulfilled. And, with an almost cruel insistence, the world moved on as if nothing had happened. I forced myself to go along without complaining. It was on any given Tuesday, while organizing old files at the community library where I worked as a volunteer assistant in the evenings, that I came across a piece of news that made me stop breathing for a moment. Ethan had been shortlisted for a state award, something big enough to put his name definitively among the most promising young entrepreneurs in the region. There was to be a ceremony in 2 months' time, open to the public. I didn't give it a second thought. Not because I wanted to confront him or out of anger, but because I needed to see with my own eyes what he had become, complete and irreversible, with no illusions to cushion the shock. During those 2 months, I worked in silence, storing every bitter thought at the bottom of a mental drawer that I only opened at night when sleep refused to come. I recovered old hobbies that I had abandoned. I read dusty books that reminded me of who I was before I was just someone's invisible support. I didn't expect any more recognition. I didn't expect apologies. All I wanted was one last proof that I could look at Ethan and not fall apart inside. On the day of the ceremony, I arrived early and sat away from the stage as usual. I watched the anxious movement of people, the excited speeches, the incessant flashes of the cameras. Ethan appeared surrounded by important figures, smiling all around, handing out hugs like someone who never had to hide a piece of himself to be accepted. When his name was announced, the auditorium erupted in applause. He stood up with impressive confidence, wearing an expensive suit that seemed tailor-made for the image he was now selling. He took to the stage and held the microphone with the firmness of someone who has rehearsed his story so many times that he even believes it. The speech was everything I expected. He didn't mention the existence of anyone who had reached out to him along the way. When he finished, the audience stood to applaud him. I sat there, hands still on my lap, feeling a strange calm invade my chest. It wasn't hatred nor sadness. It was a silent acceptance of what had always been clear. Ethan needed this narrative to be who he wanted to be. Deep down, perhaps it wasn't even a conscious choice. Perhaps erasing my name was his way of surviving, of fitting into a world that rewards those who seem invincible. When the crowd began to disperse, I got up without haste and walked to the exit door without looking back. Outside, the cold night welcomed me with an icy breath that made my eyes sting, but I didn't cry. There were no more tears worth shedding. I stopped at the cafe on the corner and ordered a hot chocolate. I sat by the window, watching the hurried movement of people. It was strange to realize that the end of an important story for me was just another ordinary Tuesday for the rest of the world. While I was absent-mindedly mixing my drink, my cell phone vibrated on the table. A new message from him. "I'd like to talk if you'd like." I stared at the screen for a few minutes. There was no more anger. There was no more sorrow capable of moving me. Only a clarity as hard as stone. It was no longer my responsibility to fix what he had broken. I deleted the notification without opening it. I sipped my hot chocolate to the last drop, feeling the heat run down my throat and warm the cold bits inside me. There, in that empty cafe, between the clatter of cups and the muffled murmur of the city, I realized that Ethan's story had never really been mine. I had carried the weight of it for too long. Now it was time to put it down and move on. Maybe he would go on to win. Maybe he would become one of those public figures, idolized and admired by crowds who would never know what was left behind. And that's fine. Not all justice is done in the public square. Not every truth needs to be told. And if you agree with me, don't forget to leave your like and comment below.